fake news, deepfakes and cheapfakes, it seems as if an infocalyps is getting closer, a society in which disinformation and misinformation flourishes. At least, that is what our main guest of tonight, Nina Schick, claims in this book, Deepfakes and the Infocalypse. And she is someone to listen to, I would say, because she has also been heard by some presidents, for example, US President Joe Biden. So, if this is the case, as a citizen, how do you know who and what to trust? What's at stake in our democracies, and how to regulate or fight back against disinformation in the digital world? In the next 1.5 hours, we're going to talk about that. My name is Tim Wagemakers. I'm your host for tonight, and this is a program which is a cooperation between the Balie and the Radboud University, and is actually the first edition of a triptych around the theme of the suspicious society. And as said, we're going to talk to Nina Schick, who is with us through Zoom. But we also have some esteemed guests right here with us in the hall. We have Rudy Bouma, acclaimed journalist for, well, the Dutch BBC Newsnight, Nieuwsuur, who last week won the prestigious Nipkoff Award for their journalism. And we have the member of European Parlement, Paul Tang, from the Labour Party, Partij van de Arbeid. And later we will be joined by Anita van Rootselaar from Radboud University. Welcome everyone, great that you're here. Nina Schick, great to have you with us. You're in London, in UK, I think?
Yes, that's right. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're very happy you're here. And just to dive into it, I read your book. It's an amazing book. You worked as a political advisor, so you're not only an outsider, but also an insider seeing what has happened. Your most recent book is called Deepfakes. It's about the crisis of mis- and disinformation, deepfakes. But I guess I was thinking about it, many people who are watching this, they know the term deepfake. They hear the discussions about fake news. I mean, if you open a newspaper, you hear fake news or misinformation coming by, but still, it's difficult to grasp. And at one point in time, for you, this topic became so urgent that you thought, I need to write something down about this. Can you take us to that moment when you thought, I really need to address this topic because I now see what deepfakes are capable of doing, actually? There must be a moment.
Absolutely. It was actually when they first started emerging deepfakes. To start with, I guess I should define. A deepfake is a piece of media. It can be a video, a piece of audio, it can be text, it can be an image that's either manipulated by artificial intelligence or entirely generated by artificial intelligence. And the ability of AI to literally create fake media is nascent. It's only been possible for around 5 years or so. And I witnessed it in its earliest kind of incantation online at the end of 2017 when these deepfake videos were emerging on the website Reddit. And what they were fake pornographic films of usually celebrities and actresses being put in these pornographic films where, you know, they actually hadn't been in those films at all. So the really incredible thing about deepfakes is the ability of AI, first of all, to create fake media, but also the ability of AI to be able to take someone's biometrics, your face, your voice, and then to be able to recreate that in fake media. And the third thing I should say about deepfakes is it's the most sophisticated form of not only media manipulation, but also media creation. And it's emerging at a time when video and audiovisual media is becoming the most important medium of communication. And this type of manipulation, which previously would have only been accessible to the Hollywood studios, you know, somebody with a multi-million-dollar budget, teams of special effects artists, AI is going to democratize that. So this kind of video manipulation in the next 5 to 7 years is going to become accessible to everyone on easy to use interfaces like apps. Now, naturally, that means, so one estimate is that by 2030, 90% of video content online is going to be synthetically generated. 90% of video online is going to be made by AI. Now, going back to the question of trust and disinformation, that is potentially devastating because not only can AI be weaponized to create fake video and audio of people saying, doing things that they never did, as we saw in the first use case in non-consensual pornography, but even more important, as synthetic media becomes ubiquitous in the information ecosystem, this idea of trust is going to decline even more. So as people understand that AI can create fake content, even authentic media comes under a big question mark. People don't trust even authentic media. So it is a very important point in the kind of recent development of our digital information ecosystem, because as I like to say, the future is synthetic, and it really puts a big question mark about, okay, well, now how do we ensure that there's actual trust in the digital information ecosystem when seeing and hearing is no longer believing?
Do you think it's overlooked too much in the whole discussion about fake news, misinformation, disinformation, the deep fake aspect? Because you're saying 2030, 90% is going to be synthetically produced on the internet.
Yeah, I actually don't think so, because one of the reasons why it's become such a compelling issue, and it's actually one that's really seized the public imagination, is because it's so visceral, right? Like, I can make a video of you saying or doing something that you never did. And until this point, we always assumed that kind of visual effect was for the movies, you know, for make-believe, for people who had a tremendous amount of resources. So the idea that that's democratized and even the proverbial teenager in the basement can do it means that there have been so many headlines around deepfakes in the last kind of 18 to 24 months, and it's increasingly becoming an urgent issue. But I think it's a mistake to analyze deepfakes as though they emerged in a vacuum, because if you look at what came before deepfakes, so-called cheap fakes or shallow fakes, that's manipulated media that has nothing to do with AI, right? It's just something that's photoshopped, or a video that's miscontextualized or just clipped and taken out of context. That has already been absolutely devastating, especially from a political disinformation perspective. So cheap fakes, the kind of forebear to deepfakes, are still doing more harm than deepfakes are doing, because actually the barriers to entry for deepfakes right now are still a little bit higher than people regularly talk about when they kind of read about the coming age of deepfakes. Nonetheless, what is happening now with cheap fakes is an indicator of how potentially deepfakes can and ultimately will be when they're used by malicious actors in the next kind of 5 to 10 years.
Because if you read your book, deepfakes is like the hook. It's the thing that pulls you in, and it's a really striking example, and also a bit of a gloomy example of what's to come if we don't prepare for it. But it's also a hook that says something about our whole information ecosystem, actually, about how we process information, what we do with it. What does it, I mean, infocalyps is like the entire bundle, because I can say the whole night misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. But if you say infocalyps, that's a word that kind of grasps the whole dynamics around it. If you talk about that, do you think that that's also something that in your work as a political advisor has not only been a theoretical aspect or something that's sort of individual circumstances, but is really changing the dynamics of politics in elections? What's your take on that?
Absolutely, and I'm sure that my fellow panelists tonight will have multiple examples where they can attest to that. Look, the point is that misinformation and disinformation, bad information, essentially, it's nothing new, right? It's as old as humanity, as old as human civilization itself. However, what's different now is the exponential rate at which bad information can travel, and now how misinformation and disinformation and media manipulation has consistently been democratized by technology. And through my work, I basically look at kind of the nexus of where politics and geopolitics meets this kind of exponentially accelerating technology of our age, which is just changing everything. And one of the things that has dramatically been transformed in the last 30 years is our information ecosystem, right? We're still grappling with the results of the internet. That was 30 years ago. Then came social media, then came smartphones. Now we're entering this new age of deepfakes and synthetic media.
But we're still running behind.
We barely had a chance to understand what the internet has done to society and politics. So consistently throughout my work in the last decade, at the forefront of major geopolitical events, for example, like the invasion of Eastern Ukraine, the shooting down of MH17, as is obviously an issue that is very close to your heart in the Netherlands. Election interference has been this consistent thread of how much more potent malign information operations have become in this new information ecosystem. And as my panelists will attest to, it is changing political realities, right?
But
and it's
then
not
the question
only,
is also, who is we in that sense? Because also chapter 2 of your book is Russia the master, in the sense that some geopolitical parties have been better at adapting to the situation, or better is maybe a bit of a sleazy word in that respect, but are using it. Those examples you name are not just random examples. So who is we in that sense? Is that the political West, or like Western Europe, or do you see the same things happening all over again, and are we all running behind?
No one is immune to this, and it exists on so many levels, because you can kind of look at malicious information operations between states, right? And in my book, I kind of started with Russia because of my background, where I was an advisor to the Secretary General of NATO, and because of my work of tracking Russian malign information operations, starting from the invasion of Ukraine all the way up to the US presidential election, right? That's in that context is how I became, an advisor to Joe Biden, because we were looking at election interference in 2020 and potentially how malicious state actors like Russia would evolve their methodology. And that's when I started looking at deepfakes. However, it's very clear, and as I continue to write in my book, that there is no way you can only point your finger at Russia and say, oh, they're the only bad actors, and they're the ones corroding the information ecosystem, because the West clearly has a problem of its own. And I would argue, and I did argue in my book, that in 2020, so the last US presidential election, I thought the problem of homegrown mis and disinformation would actually be a bigger problem than anything that any foreign state did. And indeed, that proved to be the case. I mean, the most pernicious piece of disinformation in that election campaign came from the president himself, right? That the election was not valid because somehow it was subject to widespread voter fraud. And that wasn't, that wasn't something, of course.
With success, right? 90% of the Republicans believed it.
Absolutely. And one of the really interesting things about it was that he was using a lot of manipulated media, so not deepfakes, but cheapfakes to support that narrative. So showing actual videos of voters, people counting the votes and suggesting that this was actually evidence of votes being dumped. And it became so convincing, that narrative, that it actually, we all saw what happened on January the 6th, the insurrection on the Capitol. And this is coming arguably from the most important, the leader of the free world, Western democratic state. So no state is immune. And I think that it happens both at the state level and within nations. But also, it's really important to point out that this isn't all malicious activity, right? This is the difference between disinformation and misinformation. The problem isn't that everybody sending bad information out there is doing it on purpose to undermine democracy. A lot of the damage just comes from people who are facing an abundance of information and don't know what to trust anymore. And we saw that so clearly in the pandemic, right? All over the world, where people with, not necessarily bad intentions simply don't know what to trust anymore or what to do. And we've seen kind of the consequences of that and how it plays out in real life.
But actually, we're at quite an important moment, right? We're at the forefront of French elections. We have German elections coming up. The future of Europe, if you talk about those two countries, is quite important what's happening there. You have been a political advisor. How big are the stakes if we talk about this subject in relation to the elections to come? Because at the same time, also in Dutch elections, we talk about misinformation, we talk about interference, but at the same time, we have the feeling that when we have voted, that we've had a fair and good voting procedures. And I think it has also been confirmed that in the Netherlands it was a good voting procedure. But still, how important in the coming election year is it to tackle this issue?
It's essential, and I think that obviously they have to tackle it from both perspectives. And when I say both perspectives, I mean first, the fact that your electoral processes, the actual kind of voting machines, could be subject to foreign tampering efforts, right? We saw that in the US election in 2016. In 2016, notably, it was the Russians. And in 2020, if you look at the kind of post-mortem report of what happened in 2020, it wasn't just the Russians, but many more aggressive states were getting in on the game. So the direction of travel is that many more states will try to intervene in the electoral process of democracies. And that's just the fact of the matter, in 2017, I was working on Emmanuel Macron's presidential campaign. His campaign was also hacked by the Russians. The same thing happened in 2016 in the US. There was a big also hack in Germany. So I think this is something that all politicians are aware of, and it's a national security priority to secure election systems, but also look at influence campaigns amongst your citizens that are being run on social media online. Yeah. But the more difficult thing is what I potentially see as the bigger problem, and that is the problem of mis and disinformation that's homegrown, right? Homegrown influencers or homegrown citizens who want to undermine a party and have no problem in kind of spreading really malign information around a politician or a party. And I mean, we have Paul on the panel today, and I have to say that, you know, sometimes when I hear the stories about what it is to be in the public eye and hold public office and the kind of abuse and mis and disinformation that's spread about you online, it's really a wonder that anyone really wants to hold office anymore. But
it proves your point. It's a societal problem. It's not just a tech problem. It's not just how we look at Russia, what they're doing. It's also like, how are we talking to each other? How are we assessing information? Where's the trust?
And that's why I called it the infocalyps. And the infocalyps is essentially a word to talk about this corroding information ecosystem. And the way you think about that ecosystem is that it encompasses everything. Everything exists within that ecosystem, and it's consistently becoming more corrupt. So at this stage, given that this ecosystem really, that was so transformational, really started with the birth of the internet in the late 80s and the early 90s. What we didn't do then, what those kind of tech utopian founders of the internet didn't do, because they thought, oh, well, the age of information is going to be this unmitigated good for humanity. Everyone's going to connect and, you know, liberal democracy will flourish everywhere, is we didn't inbuild any security or safety systems. And what we have to do now is reorient our society to, first of all, building the technical solutions into the fabric of the internet that can provide us some safety. And then second, looking at society-wide solutions. And this is a really big topic, you know, everything from policy to regulation to digital literacy. When you think about building resilience to this new information ecosystem that we exist in.
Yeah. Maybe lastly, before we open the panel discussion, because I think we've already had many hooks to talk about right now, is because it's also a sense of, do we know what we are talking about? And then to just one more time go back to politics. When I think about politicians and internet, I'm not talking about you, Paul. I want to show you a short clip about Mark Zuckerberg when he was being heard by Congress, just to show, well, what I sometimes think about.
Well, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
If I'm emailing within WhatsApp, does that ever inform your advertisers?
No, we don't see any of the content in WhatsApp. It's fully encrypted.
Right, but is there some algorithm that spits out some information to your ad platform? And then, let's say I'm emailing about Black Panther within WhatsApp. Do I get a Black Panther banner ad?
Senator, Facebook systems do not see the content of messages being transferred over WhatsApp.
Yeah, I know, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking about whether these systems talk to each other without a human being touching it.
Senator, I think the answer to your specific question is if you message someone about Black Panther on WhatsApp, it would not inform any ads.
Okay.
Could somebody call you up and say, I want to see John Kennedy's file?
Absolutely not.
Could you, would you do it? Could you do it?
In theory.
Do you have the right to put my data, a name on my data, and share it with somebody?
I do not believe we have the right to do that.
Do you have the ability?
Senator, the data is in the system, so...
Do you have the ability?
Technically, I think someone could do that, but that would be a massive breach.
Yeah, the music didn't help either, I think, for the congressional members. But still, you've been advising some political campaigns. Do you think that there's a sense of knowledge that has been implemented in the last years that you think that the people who are regulating or are the politicians understand what is going on? Because if I see clips like these, I'm kind of worried because I don't email in WhatsApp, for example.
I don't email in WhatsApp either. No, look, it's difficult because I have worked with politicians on kind of next generation technology, in particular AI, and kind of analyze that in a disinformation but national security aspect as well. And not all politicians are built equally, so some really get it, others don't. And in part, this is because the changes that are taking place, right, are happening so quickly. I call this age the exponential age, because if we look back on our lifetime, I mean, arguably we're going to experience more tech-led change in our lifetime than has been experienced by the entirety of humanity that came before us. So politicians, even those with good intentions, I mean, they're only human ultimately, have a difficult time sometimes, really being proactive about some of these issues, because sometimes policy and regulation tends to be knee-jerk and reactive, and by the time the lawmaker who really understands it has put together a bill and tried to get support for it and passed it, it's often watered down. And the issue which the original bill or the legislation was attempting to address will have evolved so quickly that that might not be fit for purpose anymore. So I think there really is a serious question, and maybe this is something that Paul would be willing to comment on later, about how do you create regulation and policy in an era where things are changing quite so dramatically and just so quickly, because ultimately a lot of these issues, like I say, are not only happening so quickly, but by the time the kind of policies in place, it's just not fit for purpose anymore.
Yeah. Perfect. I think we have touched upon many things already, and we can discuss the regulation later. Let's open the panel discussion. You also join in, please, Nina. Let's start with Rudy Bouma. You're a reporter for Nieuwsuur. You did 2 years of research, I think, maybe even longer, and reported on disinformation. You were undercover in
4 years.
4 years already, yeah. And that's the thing about biographies today, that I thought I shouldn't spread misinformation. But anyway, you were undercover in the dark corners of the internet. You researched a lot about it. Do you recognize the picture Nina has painted in the Dutch context? I think the Netherlands is quite a special case, actually, if you talk about the whole infocalyps that is going on right now, right?
Yeah, I agree that the homegrown misinformation, disinformation is much more of a problem than, let's say, foreign influence. We have been looking at Russia, of course, for a few years now, but the Netherlands, apart from MH17, has not been a real big victim of disinformation from other countries. To be honest, last year we had a report about the first, let's say, foreign disinformation campaign really targeted on the Netherlands, and that came from a totally different direction, from Indonesia. Because Indonesia apparently had a troll army of about 400 accounts on several social media platforms, which spread disinformation about Papua New Guinea. And well, that's something I didn't expect at all. Well, maybe it's a nice example for Nina as well, because a lot of those accounts ran deepfake pictures in their profile, and it was quite a like a professional troll army set up apparently by the Indonesians. But it didn't have too much influence at all. Not much engagement. Maybe a little bit of hijacking of hashtags. But yeah, that was probably the most specific, the best example of foreign disinformation in the Netherlands. That's probably.
Yeah. And do you have any idea of if our intelligence services also run these kind of campaigns?
If they do, I couldn't say so. But
you couldn't,
I know
wouldn't.
There are definitely parts within the Defense Department who deal with this, but there's no proof of any specific disinformation campaign by the Dutch.
And if you hear the analysis of Nina and a whole discussion about what's the thing that's for you the most urgent in this discussion, because it's a broad discussion. You can talk about trust, you can talk about the technicalities behind it, about regulations. What's for you the most interesting thing to look for as a journalist?
Well, the homegrown, because I've been debunking disinformation, especially on Twitter, for 4 years now. And when I debunk like pretty simple hoaxes, like a picture which is taken out of the context or a Photoshop, stuff like that. When I would debunk this, normally, maybe in 90% of the cases, the person I will address, saying, hey, this is disinformation, this is the source, you can check it yourself. They will not send me a thank you tweet. On the contrary, they will always, be sort of a hostile, have a hostile approach. And you don't see people learn in that way. On the other hand,
do you still do it?
I still do it.
Why?
I do it a little bit less because as you probably know, those people will not adapt after that. I do it because I hope to. I hope that there's a certain core of people who normally don't engage in those discussions, but they will see those tweets, they will see those
try
Facebook.
to reach sort of gray zone in between.
And that's probably the part of the people I would like to to reach.
So this homegrown element of it is for you, I think, the interesting thing that you focus on or are interested in. I'd like to go to Paul Tang also, member of the European Parlement, Labour Party. I think you're not like one of those congressionals who thinks emailing in WhatsApp is an option. You've been around digital affairs since 2014, I think. I think Nina already said quite some things about what we can do. How do you see your role in this discussion as a politician? Because it's a societal problem, it's a regulatory problem. What's for you most at stake?
Yeah, and I must say, I was reminded of the hearing, which I think was in 2018, probably. Mm-hmm. I must say that also politics is changing, right? So especially in Brussels, there's much focus now on regulating big tech and trying to come up with new rules for the internet. But the same is true in the Congress at this point. And so we see various initiatives, both in the Congress and outside the Congress. For example, antitrust cases brought forward to. So I think the tide is in that sense changing, and there's willingness to, at least to think about it. When I fully recognize the story by Nina, and what I find striking is that people see more and more see the problem, also the politician, but the willingness to step in is still sort of low.
Why?
That's a good question. Interfering in a market, I think, is also behind it. So when I see this, Nina had a word on security valve, safety valves, bringing securities. You can bring in securities. For example, 1 month before the elections, you don't allow political ads. This would be a simple rule. I don't see that very often happen. Whereas it's a pretty simple rule you can apply. You could apply.
Which was done in the States.
Which was done in the States, but for example in the Netherlands or in Europe, we're talking French and German election comments, I don't think this rule will apply.
Yeah. Nina?
No, I agree. I think there are kind of like a sliding scale of solutions that you could implement, and the one that Paul just talked about in the case of political ads before elections, that's quite easy to do. So why don't we do it? And then looking forward, there are really progressive technical solutions that have to do with thinking about the information ecosystem as something we all exist in. So you want to build a safe foundation. If you live in an earthquake-prone zone, you want to earthquake-proof your house. So it's about, again, building into the fabric of the internet a layer of trust. And one of the approaches that I actually think is the most compelling is the idea of media provenance and media authenticity. So you inbuild into every touch point in the internet or every kind of hardware device or every software that you interact with a trail of provenance where you can always see where that media came from, who put it out there, was it edited? And the really interesting thing about this approach is that it's no longer just hypothetical. The technology for it is being built, and it is actually, I have to say, kind of the private sector that is taking this approach forward. There is a initiative in the United States called the Content Authenticity Initiative. It's actually led by Adobe, and it has incredible partners who have joined with Adobe to kind of build provenance technology. And they've also recently launched an alliance called the C2PA, which is going to be the standards body. So you try to set the universal standard.
Yeah, but then, Paul, that's also a dilemma, right?
Now, can I? But why don't politicians step in more often? I think that's the question.
Absolutely.
one thing is that they need to interfere in a market, and they're still hesitant to interfere with companies that say themselves they are very innovative, they break things, but they move fast, right? So that's one. The other thing is, and I also realized that when Nina has her introduction, and also seeing the hearing again, there's a sort of information asymmetry, right? So and the point is not to make the discussion too technological, too technical. I think it's pretty simple. One reason we are in problems is there are commercial interests behind it that leads, it's not about the production of content itself, say the production of fake news or the production of deepfakes, it's about the dissemination. And that has been crucial. So, and the dissemination is done by the large big tech companies. If it's Facebook, Google, through YouTube or Twitter. Right? And I am surprised when I find a disconnect when in the early days of the traditional media there were fierce discussion what should be public and what should be private. And Rudy works at a public broadcast, not-for-profit company and has editorial freedom, right? Free from political pressure. That was a conscious choice, or after long discussion because we had different models. That was the discussion we had on media, on traditional media, the old media. I don't see that discussion at all on new media.
Do you
and this,
Well, first I would like to react on Nina because I think, if I'm correct, she is addressing some let's say, technological solutions to fake news. But to be honest, I addressed that myself as well. Some people in the Netherlands have an initiative about, let's say, in the blockchain, having some kind of watermark on a picture or on your content, and see if things are adjusted, right? That's what I think Nina is saying. But the people I would address on Twitter when they are spreading fake news, they don't care about these kinds of watermarks at all. I mean, if somebody's reading an article and wants to see if there were changes in the article, okay, that's a good thing. But there's a certain part of society, they will not care about that at all. So I don't think it's a solution for, let's say, photos which are taken out of the context and spread as fake news. That's.
But maybe also we have to dissect things a little bit, right? Because you have to sort of, we are running behind. So in the sense that technological innovation is going faster, so the dissemination, the regulation always comes afterwards, and you already have put things out there. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, how do we build trust or verification methods with each other? Or how do we even just literally reach each other to listen to each other and maybe revoke your opinion about something?
Well, Paul is saying politics maybe should step in. I don't think politics should step in when it's about the content.
Exactly.
They should keep themselves far away from that. And fortunately, in the Netherlands as well as in the European Parlement, I think they agree. But initiatives like, for instance, making tech platforms be transparent about, for instance, who are the donors of political ads and stuff like that. From the right to the left, nobody can be against that, right? And that's something politics definitely.
Not just about political ads. The point is, when I choose a newspaper, I have a huge variety of newspapers to choose from, and I know their political background, right? And some newspapers are right-wing, some newspapers are left-wing, or some are neutral, confessional. Do I have this choice on Facebook? Do I have this choice on Twitter? Answer is no. Who determines what content I see? That is Twitter, that's Facebook. These are commercial enterprises. We let completely commercial enterprises dictate what we see. I want a variety of choices. I would like, let's say, for Newsweek to edit my timeline. You're welcome to. I trust you on this, because I know that my timeline will not be fabricated just for sensationalism, but it provides me with quality information. I would pay for that. But we don't have the option right now. And so what we much more need is a diversity, the pluriformity on the new media. So I want to break in the timelines of Facebook and Twitter and say, okay, let someone else edit my timeline.
But then it's also because I think in the Netherlands there was an experiment with nu.nl who was kind of fact-checking for Facebook what was put on Facebook, and that was also criticism from media who were saying, why are you working with Facebook, which is sort of uneven competition because nu.nl was pushed more. So how do you, I see a sort of dilemma between the quick fix and the conversation about how do we want to process information, how do we want to build a culture that we know what's out there and how we need to deal with it. So How do you, as a politician, manage those two things? Because you have the short-term fix and you have the long-term working towards a healthy platforms, towards a healthy media.
Yeah, well, and I would like to, I want to break into the, let's say, the timelines to keep it simple. But I want to break down the commercial model, the business models of big tech that are driven by keeping our attention, hoarding data, tracking users and targeting us. That one I'd like to break. But then you need to also to come up with, let's say, with alternatives. And this is where we need to have, I think, also new ideas so that we get credible and trustworthy information also on the new media. That's the essence. But in that, we want to have independence of new media, but also the diversity at the same time. Right, so we will have right-wing media, and there will be media for Trump supporters, but it will be much more limited, I think, than what we see now. Yeah. So that's one answer that I have. Doesn't really mean that we, you say, start a conversation. I find it nowadays in this polarized society very difficult. So that's sort of my weakness.
You say it's smiling, but I think actually that's quite a striking comment from a politician.
Yeah, but this is what I find very difficult now, to start conversation. For conversation, you need people to be open-minded, and I find it sometimes, at least when you look by the social media, very difficult.
But then actually we reach a sort of core. Because if we want to have a good public debate, if we want to have a good conversation of misinformation, and one of our politicians is saying, I find it difficult to have a conversation because of these dynamics on social media, then we have quite a problem, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems in our society. You also see that, well, look at the election result in the Netherlands in March. We now have 18 parties. It seems like we are disintegrating. It's not just on social media. This is also transposed to politics. And the Netherlands, unfortunately, is not an outlier. We see that in many European countries.
I think, Nina, there's also something that maybe adds something to this analysis, and that's the liar's dividend, right? So that's also for politicians. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Because I think it adds to what Paul is saying about mistrust towards politicians in this whole fake news.
Absolutely. So the liar's dividend is a phenomenon that was coined by academics in the context of deepfakes. And what it means is that in a world where, anything can be faked, including video, which we've so far tended to see as an extension of our own perception, right? Which is why video is so compelling as evidence in a court of law. So if even video can be faked, then people lose their faith or trust in anything. If everything can be faked, everything can be denied. So liars or bad actors get this double dividend where not only can they create fake content, slandering a politician, or in the case of deepfakes, it's often been women with non-consensual pornography, but also they can decry all authentic media as fake. So there is no accountability. And the interesting thing about deepfakes is that the liar's dividend, you've already seen having some really insane case studies. So for example, in 2018, there was almost a coup d'etat in Gabon because the president hadn't been seen for a while. And it turns out that what had happened is that he had suffered a stroke, so he was laying low. And his political opponents basically said that he was dead, and a lot of kind of political instability started in the country. So to kind of quell that, president appeared in his traditional New Year's Eve address on television. But because he had had a stroke and he had probably had Botox to alleviate the symptoms of that stroke, he looked very strange. His face was frozen, his eyes looked really big. And that was used, so that authentic piece of media was then used to spur on a coup d'etat because people were saying, this is a deepfake video, this is not real, the president is dead. Luckily, there wasn't violence in the country, and the coup d'etat kind of ended without erupting into violence. But this is something that we have seen in democratic discourse as well. One of the most poignant examples that I saw in my research was last year in 2020, just after the George Floyd video had come out. A video that was so visceral because it was so awful what we saw there, that it united not only Americans but the whole world in protest, right? Millions of people around the world protesting. And it wasn't long before that video was dismissed as a deepfake. And it didn't come from a really fringe actor, right? It came from a African-American woman. She has a PhD, and at the time she was standing to be elected to the US House of Representatives. And she released a 24-page report, academic report, into why the whole George Floyd video was a deepfake hoax, and that George Floyd had actually died in 2016, and the guy in the video is a former NBA player. So the liar's dividend is this idea that, you know, in a world where anything can be faked, nothing can be believed anymore. And when it comes to deep fakes, although it was coined in the context of deep fakes, of course this is true for cheap fakes as well, or any kind of mis or disinformation. It's this core idea of trust, right? No trust in institutions, no trust in political parties, no trust in the traditional media. And this is, again, what Rudy was referring to earlier when he's like, talking about certain people who you can kind of show them the verified, you know, this is a fake, and they won't believe you, you know, because their cognitive biases means that, you know, they're absolutely not going to trust actually, any authority.
Rudy, you have to prove that you're real. That's the paradox of it, right?
I think I have to do like this. Yeah, well, actually, this is not about the liar's dividend, but we had a striking example in the Netherlands a few weeks ago when parliament members had a video call with the assistant of opposition leader Navalny. They tricked, this actor tricked those parliament members, but then it was very quickly concluded by a Baltic parliament member who also fell for this trickster that it was a deep fake. There was a deep fake live filter on the video call, and that was the story at first, but then later it appeared it was not a deep fake at all. It was just a good actor. Yeah. So let's not overestimate the consequences of deep fakes at this point, because, well, as we saw, it was some kind of Borat, but impersonating the assistant of Navalny.
But actually the concept of deepfakes is already eroding the idea of what's real and not, even if it's not deepfake.
So if I could just jump in, that actually is the perfect example of the liar's dividend, because there's been so much of almost like a media hype or hysteria about deepfakes that as soon as that story came out, it was reported as a deepfake all over the international press, right? And at the time, I was a bit skeptical. Because there had been a few other instances reported in the international fake of a malicious deepfake. And when it transpired that it was just some, you know, impersonator or spammer, nothing to do with AI or deepfakes, of course, you undermine trust even further. If the media sources who are supposed to be kind of the arbiters of truth and accurate information are getting stories like this wrong, then you further undermine trust. So the sense of like reality, people being like, oh, it's a deepfake, it's not a deepfake, nobody knows what's what anymore. So I'll just use my own cognitive bias to decide what's true or not. So my truth, your truth, no objective reality, right? And this is really the core of why this is an existential threat, in particular to liberal democracies, because if you live in a liberal democracy, you need to be able to have some kind of a basic agreement on what objective reality or truth is, because we need to do consensus building to deal with the issues in our society. But adversely, this kind of corroding information ecosystem and tenuous grip on reality is something that could actually be really beneficial to authoritarian nation states, right? So it's having almost having a different effect based on the political system or the political model in which you live in. Because if, of course, an authoritarian regime like China, for example, which has a unique control over its information ecosystem, has the power to say, well, this is the reality, this is the imposed reality, and has with its kind of social monitoring system the ability to impose one truth, then that could be a form of consensus building. Whereas in democratic societies, because we have a free and open society and we stand for these liberal values of freedom of information, freedom of expression, what we're actually seeing is it's called censorship through noise. Too much information, unmitigated information, good and bad, and that is having the effect of censoring our society, really.
Paul, can you take this, because actually this is also something I think that in a politician's work, also societal, but in a politician's work is difficult. That at the one hand, we've all seen that the internet or the open information systems we have are very emancipatory. It's a way of activists to express themselves, and at the same time, you want to have a sort of perfectly fitted code to be able to do something about the moments when it goes wrong or when it's real misinformation. So the values maybe you are propagating can also flip to the effects you don't want. How do you assess, when you think about regulations or when you think about political decisions, this balance between these two things?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's finding the balance probably is the answer, the somewhat boring answer, but it's true. And finding that balance is not always easy, like I said, because you always see that the lack of understanding of the technical difficulties or the unwillingness to step in also impedes. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just looking here for what you.
Yeah, you're struggling with how to deal with that.
Yeah, let's keep it to that.
Yeah. So how do you assess regulations coming in that sense?
Yeah, I'm just well. How do you assess regulation? What you try to do is understanding of what's at stake, right? So, and that there are different views on this. For example, now one of the good things that we see now is that what we see, there's a lot of discussion of artificial intelligence. And I remember Cathy O'Neill's book, it's called Artificial Weapons of Mass Destruction.
Yeah.
Well, to start with, you want to unbox the black box. That's what you usually see. So what we see is first a drive for more transparency, to understand the black box, to understand the technology that's behind it. And I think that's essential to get there. But imposing on the structure as it is now, that is more difficult, because I see a growing awareness, but not necessarily consensus in politics on what is the next step. So I take a position, like I already made my expose on that. I don't believe that our new media should be in commercial hands. I don't think that's a wrong starting point. But you need to find consensus, because you need majorities in parliaments. And finding this majority also, so from awareness we go to action, but action requires actually consensus. And the consensus is not always there. You see this in Europe, but you also see on the other side of the transatlantic, where the Congress is pretty much divided, not necessarily across party lines, and finding this. But myself, I'm very much pushing for much more, imposing more structure on. I don't think this is a market at all. Yeah. What we have right now.
You don't believe in self-regulations. You don't think.
I don't believe in self-regulation. No, it's a very opaque market, right? There is. I don't pay for this. I get a service, that's clear. I have let's for example Gmail. I have a social media platform, but I don't pay for it, and I'm not sure how to end this service. Can you ever end Google, so to say? Can you ever end Facebook if they follow and tracking you? And this makes it completely weird. Yeah. And it's also the sovereignty of the consumer, which is an idea that we like to have also ourselves, is gone in that sense. Yeah. Doesn't have to be the way. What I find fascinating in this time, some markets are pretty well structured. For example, take the streaming services. I think Netflix has been a lifesaver during COVID times. But what I find surprising is that I thought that Netflix could corner the market. I don't think it will. In my own household, I now have some sort of 7 or 8 streaming services. Yeah. It's amazing, and partly it's because also you can share your subscription, so we sort of share. But also many students have many subscriptions. They are not that expensive. You know, a lot of choice.
Myself, I would pay for a platform which doesn't track me and doesn't give me ads and is not data driven. But now, you know, Facebook, WhatsApp, their Instagram, they're just too big. All your friends are on it. Eh? Yeah. So the small ones don't have any chance. Yeah,
but at the same time, we talk about Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. But if we've been doing some research about online sexual intimidation, but also if you look at COVID, then the Telegram, for example, is the place where it's also a bit of a waterbed effect, right?
Yeah. Actually, the Utrecht Data School did a survey very recently, and they looked at Telegram groups, and they really looked, okay, the let's say conspiracy theories and stuff which is going around there, are they having an influence on real life? Mm-hmm. And then it appeared, yes, in the groups where there's a lot of hatred and conspiracy theories, those were the groups when they were calling for a protest. those protests would get out of hand. Those were the protests which escalated pretty quickly. So they really saw a very tight connection between those two things. But Telegram obviously is not moderated, well, at all, maybe a little bit, but very little. So that's quite a problem. All the people, are moderated on Twitter or Facebook and they're going to Telegram, and yeah, it's sort of a cowboy Wild West land out there right now.
Yeah. Maybe if we're going to dive into trust a bit more, so I would like to invite Anita van Rootselaar also to the table. Maybe we can look in the meantime to a clip of you from Newsyear, how also offline these online manifestations have been in COVID. We can look at that, and then you can sit there. We have a small clip.
Wat is het verband tussen complottheorieën en die escalerende protesten? En gaandeweg troffen wij aan dat de invloed van complottheorieën regelmatig leek te leiden tot escalaties op straat. Denk aan bijvoorbeeld de belaging van Pieter Omtzigt.
Satanisten, die satanisten, dat is toch normaal?
Ja, dat zijn termen die we echt direct kunnen relateren aan complottheorieën.
Het is echt bizar.
Iemand reguliere media.
Wat hier lijkt te spelen is dat inderdaad het afzetten tegen een reëel probleem soms ervoor kan zorgen dat mensen ook vatbaarder zijn voor complottheorieën. Dat betekent niet dat ze per se direct geloven in deze complottheorieën, maar dat in ieder geval de hardere retoriek, toch dat anti-establishment retoriek, dat die wat gemakkelijker wordt overgenomen. En dat kan dus zorgen voor meer verharding van de houding van de protestbeweging.
Yeah. So actually, that was your point being made again. Yeah. Maybe before we go to Anita, there's one example today I thought that is quite striking, because here in Holland, in the Netherlands, in Bodegraven, because of a conspiracy theory actually, and it said that there were bodies of young people that were abused and murdered by a network of Satanists and pedophiles.
In the 80s, yeah.
In the 80s, right. Yeah. And people visit the local cemetery to lay down flowers, and both a list with the names of the victims and perpetrators was spread by three men who invented this fake theory. And actually something happened there, right? Because a judge has ruled today that those three men are not allowed to write on the subject anymore. And they
have to delete everything they spread already.
But is this an important moment? Because the ruling said, in this case, the interest in being protected from unfounded suspicions outweighs the freedom of expression. Yeah. And I thought that's something special in today's dynamics. Have you seen that before?
I'm not sure in a legal way, but the case is pretty striking, because those stories, I've been looking into those stories since February, right? And they're totally unfounded. It's sort of a satanic ritual abuse story in the 80s. We saw those stories also. And now the judge is saying, okay, freedom of expression has its limits when it's totally unfounded and people are hurt. And in this case, people are hurt, not physically, of course, but emotionally. But there are two cases. Today we had the ruling that those three people, they have to erase everything they put online about these conspiracy theories. But last week, in the same case, we saw a normal trial against one of the three, and he was put to jail for 9 months because, he said that the lawyer of this city had to go to a military tribunal and been sentenced to death. And also, he said some things about Jaap van Dissel, the boss of our RE.
Our own Fauci.
Yeah, that's right, our own Fauci, and was sentenced 9 months. So in this case, in February, I thought, okay, this is a group who can do everything, in this Wild West I was talking about. But now you see, no, they can't do everything. There are laws for this, and there's a control mechanism.
There's some optimism there. Anita van Rootselaar, glad to have you with us. You're a journalist and political philosopher. You created a podcast series for the Democratic Laboratorium of the Radboud University around the question, is our democracy under pressure? Yes. Well, we've been talking about that already for a bit.
Indeed.
Is there something in this whole conversation that first of all, you are thinking most about while listening to this?
There were lots of things that I heard to unpack where I thought, oh, that's interesting. But one thing I particularly found interesting is you were talking about the balancing act, and we're talking right now about freedom of speech and its limits. And I think it's important, especially when we're talking about social media platforms such as Facebook, we used to say, well, those are private companies, so they can regulate what's on there because it's a private company. But I think we can all agree right now that social media platforms are a public sphere. They're a part of civil society, and as such, we should treat them as such, and also regulate them as such. So it's important to make sure that free speech is not harmed in any way. So in that sense, I think also the distinction that Nina Schick also makes between disinformation and misinformation is also quite important, because I think you should really actively fight disinformation, which is consciously meaning harm, spreading disinformation with which you mean harm, while misinformation is just, well, wrong information without an intention in harm. And I think, I mean, if you talk about freedom of speech, when I'm just here in this room or wherever I am, I mean, I am allowed to, I don't know, say things that are wrong, make mistakes, lie. I mean, I'm not being punished for that. And I think that's something we should preserve. So, yes, we should accept that some people say things that are wrong on social media, but we should definitely fight the disinformation part. And of course, when you talk about the examples that were just mentioned, I mean, in real life, we have laws for slander, for example, and you're not allowed to say something about someone that's just plainly untrue and harmful. And I think we just do need to find ways to maybe change those types of laws, so that they are better adjusted to the digital platforms. Another one thing I would want to mention is that we are talking about all the risks, and yes, there are problems, and they are real. And I mean, everybody that has listened to the last, I don't know, 1 hour of conversation, that's clear. But it's not. I don't want it to be just a doomsday story, because the internet also provides opportunities, and we already, I think someone mentioned the democratic effect of internet. I mean, people often talk about the bubbles and that you're in a bubble in internet. And while, of course, algorithms are prone to give you information that confirms what you already think, I think it annoys me when people say that, because in real life, my circle of people that I talk to is way smaller. Yes, so it's also an opportunity to see opinions that are different from mine. And also research shows that in reality, most people on social media platforms have quite a diverse network ideologically, and that in turn makes sure that they're not as prone to radical ideas, and that they're milder in that sense. So there are many positive effects, of course, but and there's also, from the other side, like the politicians, journalists, we can also use it because it's a source of information. It's a perfect antenna, or not a perfect antenna. It's quite an imperfect antenna.
But it's an antenna at least.
For what's going on in society, because of course the internet does amplify things that create fuss, things that people get angry about. So yes, you do get an echo chamber of the more extreme views because people respond to them more. But it is an antenna. It's also a way to get into contact with those people. I would say people that say that mainstream media are all just trying to manipulate you, invite them to your newsroom and show them around today. Show them how it's going. That's what I would say.
But then we also reach always the more difficult part of this conversation, because we're going to talk about trust and how we can listen to each other, and that's also something that, well, it's difficult for yourself to see. I mean, we have a politician who says, I actually don't like what's going on right now, and I'm not feeling that safe actually to have conversation there. A journalist who says, I try to convince people on Twitter, I tell them, but they're not listening to me, so I'm actually communicating with a sort of gray zone who I don't see and I hope to influence. Nina, if you in your book, you also end like allies unite, right? We have a sort of societal job to do to create a sort of better conversation culture or a sort of better media culture. I think people can get a bit depressed also listening at this hour, like we're doomed, what are we going to do? Where do you see how we can take some steps in this respect? Because for me, I think like, okay, I'm going to go on Twitter this weekend, but discussing is no use because people won't listen. And then on Monday my work starts again and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what Anita said, and, you know, it's certainly not all doom and gloom. But I think the defining characteristic is that because of the technology-led change and the way in which our relationship with consuming information, but also producing information, not only writing information, but we're all going to become producers of video content, audio content, and being able to share that, within seconds with almost anybody in the world, is that the bigger story here is that this is just a huge paradigm change in the way that we communicate, in the way that society and politics functions. And I think part of the problem is that a lot of the ways that our society is set up is that we have legacy systems for the analog age. And now that might be from how we treated the free press and how that isn't, something that we figured out a new system for with new media, as Paul was discussing. It also has to do with our legal systems, because as we've already discussed again today, if you become the victim of misinformation campaign or disinformation campaign online, there's often no recourse. You can't kind of go to the policeman and say, okay, well, I'm the victim of this cyber attack and this malicious disinformation. And again, as we already discussed today as well, we know that what happens in this so-called virtual space actually has tangible impacts in the physical world, right? I've seen that repeatedly in my career in politics over the last 10 years. Rudy discussed it as well. I don't think that's controversial at all. So the idea then, I think, is just like all technologies of the exponential age, this is an amplifier of human intent. So those who are bad actors are absolutely going to find a way to weaponize the internet. Those who have good intentions, entrepreneurs, journalists, everyone sitting on this panel, we all know how wonderful this information ecosystem has been for us as well, in terms of being able to communicate to people who are interested in our ideas, in order for us to be able to do research, to do all kinds of things which would have just been impossible 30 years ago. So again, the way we need to think about it is a paradigm change, and the only way you can tackle the vastness of this paradigm change is by taking a networked approach. So there is, when you think about the ecosystem, and how vast it is and how it encompasses everything, you can't just say, oh, it's the social media company's responsibility. They absolutely have a huge role to play, but it's not only the social media companies. Policymakers, regulators, startups, private sector companies who are building kind of technical solutions for media provenance and authenticity, like I already discussed, all of that needs to come together. Now, the reality is, it's given that a lot of the theme that we've talking about today is how difficult it is to reach consensus in an age of an abundance of information, you're probably not going to get all the stakeholders around the table at the same time engaging. But there are already groups of stakeholders dealing with various different elements of these problems, whether it's the legal perspective, whether it comes to digital literacy, whether it comes to building the technology, and that work is already happening. So if you look throughout the history of how technology has changed human communication, there's always a period of adjustment. So, the printing press led to the Reformation, which changed the course of history, right? But between the printing press and the birth of modern photography, arguably the next big kind of technological revolution in human communication, there were 400 years. Now, what's happened to us in the past 30 years is that it has all happened so quickly, and that is, again, one of the defining characteristics of this exponential age that we live in, where the change is just happening at a rate that is so monumental that it is going to take a while for society to catch up. But I am not pessimistic. All of us on the panel here, I think, are fighting the good fight, and we know of initiatives and organizations and technology, and it is going to take a while for all of that to come together.
You actually have an excellent source list at the end of your book also, where you can look. But Paul, we don't have the, we're in a paradigm shift. And it takes some time, not 400 years, because we're not between the printing press and the rest. It's a bit more faster, but at the same time, we want to do something, right? We want to be an active change. Apart from the technological, because I think you've made that fundamental point, if we don't address the way we deal with markets, or the flawed market that we think it is, but apart from that, as it's also a political culture problem. How do you see your responsibility in this paradigm shift going on as a politician? What can you do? Because also in the European Parliament, you deal with trying to get a conversation going, but the thing is, people look at it and think who to trust.
Sure. Now, and this is this is the difficult part. And what I try to do as a politician, policymaker, is to make sure that what is in the public domain goes to the public domain, right? So that it comes out of private commercial hands. And I think that's important. Just one point. Of all the digital ads, 1 in every 2 is done by Google and Facebook. And in value terms, that's even more. So we have huge middlemen drawing the money out of the traditional media. That's one of the victims of, and journalisms were not paid very well 30 years ago. They are even paid worse nowadays. So that I find that a problem, because we always thought that there was an integral part of our democracy, right? So what I can do as a politician is try to stop it and reverse that, and to come to an end of the commercial interest in our public domain.
Yeah.
Then again, then the difficult question is, and there I look very much at public and private initiatives to come up with new forms that fit into this age, where you indeed try to connect with people. And but this is I would happy to do that, but I think we need also to have this from bottom up.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned the advertisements of Google and stuff like that, because, I mean, and the relationship with journalism, because indeed the big journalistic companies right now, they say we have to compete. I mean, we're not competing with just the newspapers in this country. We're competing with Google. We're competing with Facebook, which is quite a different league.
And they're completely dependent, starting to become dependent on Google and Facebook. Google and Facebook have embedded employees at the advertisers and at the publishing houses to make best use of Google or Facebook. And so these are giants, really, and they have been. And they have their influence everywhere.
And look what happens, for example, if as a news media company, you use Facebook to promote your articles, you use Twitter, and if you do something that gets stuck within the algorithm as wrong content and gets banned, then you see all the visits go down, because then there's so many visits from Facebook, from all those media too. It's an important source. So, and also when you look at app stores, for example, that sell subscriptions, they get a part of the income from said media outlets.
This is the pessimistic part, but the optimistic part is that last year we saw a huge growth in subscriptions to newspapers, for instance.
True.
And also a lot of people, more people watch television programs like the one I'm working with, and we just saw the digital news survey of Reuters Institute to Oxford University, and I was very curious. I read it every year, and normally it's pretty stable. The trust in the Netherlands in news media is pretty high. We're on the 3rd place with Denmark, right? So it's a good position, but I was very curious if we could maintain this position this year, because it at one point looked like we're a little country full of conspiracy theorists, all being very anti-media, etc. But what we saw was actually an increase in trust in media. I must say it's totally different with the youngest group, 18 to 24, who are more rely on social media. But in all the other groups, they are, having less trust in social media, more trust in news media. So I think that's a very positive story.
And also media consumption has risen as well.
Right.
Yeah.
But how do you listen? Because then actually I can pose the same question I posed to Paul in the political domain. Like, if you talk about, I mean, we don't have to go through the entire example. But for example, the media, they do media criticism towards themselves. And if you read the newspapers or hear the debates, you get the idea that the media is not being trusted that much sometimes, because there's an open culture of discussing about it. For example, if a producer of a documentary maybe wants to or not wants to Photoshop a seatbelt in a documentary, then the entire media, this was a real example, Nina, in the Netherlands, but then you have to. Then there is a big debate about that. And I always feel like I read those reports too. I see the amount of trust rising in the media, and at the same time you get a totally different view of the media when you just sort of open your newspaper or start your talk show or start your media consumption. So how do you think we can get out of that? Because we can also promote much more that we're saying the trust has risen, but we're talking about how no one trusts mainstream media. I'm exaggerating a bit.
Well, I think it is exaggerated that the media that distrusted, because every survey you read has this consistent trend. That in the Netherlands there's a huge trust in news media. So I don't think we should be so pessimistic.
But can we? No, there's no reason to be optimistic. Let's look at the opportunities. But still,
pessimistic.
Don't be. Let's be pessimistic. No. Right. Thank you for correcting.
You want to make optimistic.
But look at regional broadcast companies. They are completely gone. So we now have local democracies without journalism. And this is what I don't. If you really think that journalism is an integral part of democracy, why don't we invest in regional?
Despite the fact that there's a lot of trust in local media in the same survey.
But of course, but at the same time, it is declining, right? So and this we need to turn around. As a politician, I would like to say, well, we need to invest in regional journalism. But I don't want to be the politician who say, well, this is what journalism should look like. So this is where I look also at journalists saying, well, tell me how which should be done. Because it cannot be the politicians that run the show and on this.
Actually, I think Nina said we have to have a sort of integral approach, a sort of big approach, and we've discussed many things tonight. We're now talking about the local media and how that also waters down maybe trust and what's happening there. Maybe to conclude this conversation, the book is called Deepfakes and the Infocalyps, What You Urgently Need to Know. Well, now we know that. So maybe we can do a short round of what you urgently need to do to maybe work on that. Can I start with you, Anita?
What we urgently need to do? Well, that's of course a very difficult question to answer, but I think...
Keep it small, maybe.
I think one of the things is, I mean, I already talked about the internet, or especially social media as a public platform, and I think what you see now is that there's a lot of self-regulating within social media companies, where Twitter is fact-checking their content and stuff, which is, I mean, I'm glad they're doing something, but I mean, one thing you don't want is a social media company or any private company to decide what is right or what is true or what is not. In fact, you don't want anyone to have a monopoly on truth, which means you need some sort of institutions that can guarantee that that doesn't happen. You need a place to appeal to if something is
maybe an oversight board.
What?
The oversight board. Facebook's oversight board.
Maybe something like that. But you need something. And the difficult thing, of course, here is that the internet is international. And, and so at what level do you create those institutions? That's of course, difficult.
But a call for institutions.
Yes.
Rudy?
Well, the responsibility of the big tech companies is a big thing, because the publisher, as we know it, maybe I can give an example. There was this columnist of a British newspaper called Katie Hopkins, probably Nina knows her. She was spreading a lot of disinformation on Twitter. Actually, her account is gone now. But she was spreading a lot of disinformation. There was no consequence for her at all. But when she spread disinformation in her column, in her newspaper, there was, she had to, her company, her publisher had to pay a lot of money to certain people she accused of something, right? So that difference to me is insane, that somebody can spread a lot of disinformation on social media without any consequences, and then if she does the same in a newspaper, she's held accountable. If she does it on social media, she should be held accountable in the same way, in my opinion.
But it's kind of the old-fashioned thing of saying, okay, I'm responsible for you in the workplace, but when you go out the door and you do something, well, it's not at the workplace. Yeah,
but that's the discussion whether the big tech companies are a platform on which they are not responsible for the content, or are they the publishers?
And if I go to the last question, what you urgently need to do, maybe just as a journalist, because that's your profession?
On an individual level, I try to reach out as much as possible, apart from making my reports, for instance, on social media, and try to explain what I'm doing, because a lot of times I take it for granted. I think, okay, everybody knows what a representative poll is, or, you know, I think everybody knows that we've got a document in our newsroom which guarantees our independence. But especially young people, also referring to the survey I mentioned, they don't know that. They think, okay, I'm paid for by the state of the Netherlands, by tax money. Probably I will, sweet talk to them. They don't know how it works, and I think individual journalists should reach out as much as possible on social platforms, despite the fact that you get a lot of hate speech as well.
Because that's also, you ask them to be vulnerable in that sense.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. I understand people that they don't want to be a target of all kinds of hate speech, but I think have a thick skin and go out there.
And take some weekends.
Can I add something to what you said, because I think it's interesting the example you gave where doing something online has different consequences to something in real life. And also I thought Nina said at one point that the internet or what happens online has real consequences in the real world, and I think we should even go further and say the internet is part of the real world. It's just as real as anything else, and we should treat it as such. That's important, I think.
Paul, the same question to you. What you urgently need to do? Well, there's one thing you need to break up. That's what you want to do.
It's not break up, it's break open, right? We need break open the platform so that we get diversity on these platforms. Make sure that the middleman is cut out. So Google and Facebook need to be gone so that the money flows again to journalism. And indeed, we need to invest in journalism also on the new media, and learn in that way that there are channels of information that provide you bad news or good information, so to say, bad information and good information, and hopefully that people will learn, also the young, that you need to value good information. So let's make sure that that good information drives away bad information. So you could also say that, coming back to the start, deepfakes, if it's really destroys the trust, it could very much destroy the trust of the new media as well, right? So you need also to restructure the new media to make sure that all the noise, as Nina said, will not make this media disappear. But I agree, let's face it, it has enormous potential. I still look at Twitter, it has democratized our media, and that's very welcome.
So in that sense, that's also a bit optimistic in that sense, that maybe people don't want the noise in the end, and that could also be a threat to the social platform itself.
Especially in the last year, subscriptions has gone up, trust in the traditional media has gone up. People want to
Nina, maybe to conclude, because I think you've been talking about your book for months, weeks, a year already. In all these conversations, and also this conversation today, what's like the conversation that needs to continue right now? I mean, what's the thing that we need to continue on working right now?
I think we've broadly touched upon it at so many points in this panel, but I think one of the most vital things is not to conceive of this ecosystem, this corroding information ecosystem, as something that's virtual, intangible, that doesn't where the normal rules of society don't apply. Because as we've seen, they do apply. It is part of the real world. And if you took this approach to any other sector, for example, like pharmaceuticals or food, and there was no regulation and anyone could just do whatever the hell they wanted and there's no accountability, you could sell it just doesn't work. And I think we need to think about this information ecosystem in the same way, both in terms of good regulation, accountability, but also in building, like I said, layers of trust and transparency, so you can see where content came from, who put that out there. And of course, I really appreciate Rudy's remark earlier that you can't convince everyone with those kind of safety mechanisms inbuilt, but so many good actors want that. It's not so many good citizens want that. Actually, I would argue it's vital for the future of commerce, because how are you going to do business online if there's no mechanisms to ensure any trust? So it's not only vital for democracy, it's vital for commerce as well. And then the second point I'd make, just speaking to anybody in the audience as an individual, because it is true that now in this kind of Wild West, this ecosystem inundated with mis and disinformation, there are, very potent and real threats where an individual can be targeted in a way that wasn't possible not too many years ago. So be aware of those risks, but also be critical without becoming cynical. Because when you become cynical, again, this is the point that Rudy was referring to earlier, when you don't trust anything anymore, that really is, the worst place, where you're like, don't believe anything, don't want to collaborate with anything. So be critical without being cynical as an individual, but do be aware of how this information ecosystem can impact you on a personal level as well.
Yeah, be critical, don't be cynical. I think that's a perfect note to end on. I'd like to thank you all for talking. Nina Schick, Rudy Bouma, Paul Tang, and Anita van Rootselaar. It was a pleasure talking to you all. And in the fall, we will continue this series in combination with Radboud University. So stay tuned and thanks for watching.